So that was Todd Rogers. We are suing Los Angeles County, the court system, to change their zero bail system. Now, as Todd talked about, this is a movement that's going on around the country, and my next guest is an expert on what is going on around the country. It relates to this, and that is Ken Good. Now, Ken is the graduate of Texas Tech Law School. He's also argued multiple cases in the Texas appeals courts, and I think it was California. I'm sorry, the U.S. Fifth Circuit on a variety of issues. I'm assuming some of them have bail reform, but he's an expert on bail reform. He's on the board of the Professional Bondsmen Association of Texas, and he is going to bring us. Let's bring Ken on. Ken, thank you for joining us here. And I'm here in California. I'm assuming you're in Texas, the red state. I'm that one. Me and Todd are the red guys that were holding on. We're trying to bring some common sense and sanity to California, where there is almost none. But thanks for coming on my show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed listening to Todd Rogers and y'all's conversation. So I mean, hey, it educated me a lot on some of the issues that I was not aware of on the specifics. And so I am very much appreciative for you to have allow me to come on and talk about these issues.
Well, this is a fight that's going on around the country, right? And bail reform is being pushed, whether rightly or wrongly, regardless of the jurisdiction and what the rules are there, because it's being ideologically driven. And which, as Todd said, do you want to? It's probably a good idea that we educate our audience. What exactly is bail and bonds? What is that, and how does it fit in the criminal justice system?
Okay, so, bail has nothing to do with guilt or innocence. It has everything to do with what assurance you are going to give the court that you're going to return to respond to the charges that are being filed against you. I mean, bail dates back all the way to the Magna Carta, if you think about it, because before the Magna Carta, the king in England could hold you on charges, and if you never tried the charges, then you never got released from, the dungeon. And so the Magna Carta was the first time the king put restrictions on his ability to hold dukes before a trial. And so the whole concept of bail dates all the way back to then. It came over based on the common law with when people came to the United States. And so the purpose of bail is to assure that you're going to come back. And it's kind of interesting because California seems to have turned that whole principle on its head and has tied the hands of judges 14 different ways so that they have no discretion whatsoever. And so I understand that the concept was, hey, we're going to protect the poor. We're going to protect the poor from the judges taking advantage of them. But they've turned it now on their heads. And as long as gangs and organized crime and career criminals stay within those group of crimes that are charge-based release, they can make money hand over fist. And that's what's happening.
Yeah, it's, you heard me talking to Todd Rogers, and just to clarify, so when I was still working, I was asked to work with the MacArthur Foundation, and I saw a lot of material on your website regarding the MacArthur Foundation and their efforts around the country. So, and they would say that it's about the poor, but and I also worked on a pilot in LA County for bail reform, and then I had to do an analysis of a state effort several years ago to do statewide bail reform for senior executives in the department. So I'm a little familiar with the risk-based analysis that was initially proposed for bail reform, but we don't do that now. I mean, we just embrace this. Everybody goes no matter what. We don't do any risk assessment. And so I kind of wanted to get into, well, first of all, what's going on in Texas? I know are you guys embracing any of these kinds of bail reform concepts? Because I have a lot of guests from Texas, so I need to see where you guys are at in comparison to California.
We are not, except for Houston, Texas. So the Texas legislature passed SB 6 2 sessions ago, which strengthened the criminal justice system. We limited the use of these free release mechanisms for violent offenses. And so and we required judges to review criminal histories before setting bail. And you and I know the criminal history is the best indicator of future action. So I think we've strengthened them. The problem with Houston, with Harris County, is there was a federal lawsuit called O'Donnell versus Harris County, which has ultimately been reversed, but it's still, there's shockwaves still going on in Harris County and across the country, because that was the first lawsuit that was pushing these types of reforms. And in Texas, the only way you could get them to pass was through litigation. And so they ended up entering into a settlement. And so they entered into a settlement where they agreed to implement many of these reforms, especially for misdemeanors like you're seeing in California. And the problem is ultimately that case was reversed by the Fifth Circuit. They've reversed the judge 6 or 7 or 8 times now. The last ruling the Fifth Circuit made on this case was en banc, which means all 16 judges or it was before all 16 judges of the Fifth Circuit. And they said this case, O'Donnell, should have never been filed in federal court. And yet Harris County is still abiding by the settlement, even though it's been reversed. The reasoning is no longer sound. And the Fifth Circuit has said that case should have never been filed in federal court. So they can never enforce it. But the politics are such in Harris County that it's crazy. And so they use these simple release mechanisms on almost all misdemeanors. And we're seeing the same thing that y'all are seeing in California, and nobody wants to talk about it. So what are you seeing? I did a podcast with the DA from Yolo County. He said across the state of California, there's an 80% failure to appear rate on misdemeanors.
Yeah.
You know, and I know what an 80% failure to appear rate does to the criminal justice system. It creates huge backlogs. Yep. It puts pressure on the courts to dismiss cases, which is de facto decriminalization. And criminals see that as a green light to commit more crime. And
well,
that's not good.
So this was, as you heard, it was something that has been in place in Los Angeles for a long time, and it was basically due to overcrowding. So,
well, I would even disagree. It's not, I mean, you've always had overcrowding, but the mandate that came to get rid of people from prison or release people from prison was based on a federal ruling that California couldn't provide sufficient medical care.
Yeah.
And so they ordered them to reduce their jail population to 150% of capacity instead of 200% of capacity, or maybe it was 125%. And that's what pushed this. That issue went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and the minority, it was a 5-4 decision, and the minority said, we cannot be advocating the release of criminals.
Yeah. And
that minority is now the majority at the Supreme Court. So if that case or a similar case would come back to the Supreme Court, I think it would have a different result. So if you look at that history, you can then say everything that's going on in California doesn't have one ounce of anything to do with reducing crime. It's just to reduce the jail and the prison population. We don't care about crime.
Yeah, that was just to take LA County as much. So LA County has the largest jail system in the country, and I used to have to manage their population. It was like a big Tetris game, but and we were under federal consent decrees to keep our jail population under a certain amount. So that's why we cited people out. And as you heard Todd Rogers talk about, if we had a warrant that was under 25,000, we used to have to recite them out. Now it's 50,000.
Yeah.
And here, one of the big challenges that is exactly there's been this cascading effect. The lawsuit at the state level to reduce the prison population, all Brown did was he passed a realignment and pushed state prison inmates into jail
and to the counties.
Into jails. And then those jails are still under the caps. I mean, they're still under the capacity caps that they have for their facilities. And so then they have to embrace strategies to keep populations low.
Absolutely. That's a good point, because that's exactly what happened. It pushed it to the counties, and the counties had no other choice.
Yeah, and we do have a bunch of people on the left here in LA County in charge that don't believe in jails at all. They want to end incarceration altogether. And, and I worked on some very successful programs to reduce recidivism. So when I hear them talk about, like I looked at, let's bring up the review of the failed bail reform right there. I read your study, and you go ahead and take that down. And I recently read an LA Times article where they talked about, and we need to really hit this one, because this is something they talk about all the time. If we put people, low-level offenders, into jail, then they are going to come out with a higher propensity to commit crime. Therefore, crime goes up. That is how they sell this. Now, I understand what they're talking about. You have low and medium and high to recidivate. If you mix low to recidivate with medium to high, they're likely to develop criminogenic factors and then come out and commit crimes. Now, in LA County, we didn't mix those guys because we basically cited out low-level misdemeanors all the time.
You didn't keep low people.
We didn't keep low people, so it really doesn't. So when the LA Times says this stuff, they're really lying because they're not. They haven't. They didn't vet out the story. They didn't ask any real experts who know what's going on. Because if they had called me and says we don't have, well, you could just look at the population and see we don't have that in custody.
Well, but what they're saying is we have to give up on public safety. You
Yes.
know, because of the risk that these people become worse criminals, we can't have public safety because all the things that you're talking about, all the things that we're doing on misdemeanors that are causing 80% failure to appear rates, that is now making misdemeanors the training grounds for future felons. And the only reason why it's not much worse is we've changed felonies to misdemeanors to artificially decrease crime. And then we're not prosecuting certain of those that we changed from felony to misdemeanor more, like theft under $950. And we're just pushing that and making a worse situation. We've got the federal government coming out now and say crime is down. But what they're saying is we've made so many things not crimes anymore. It's just public disorder. No, we are severely harming public safety because we're giving up on crime, because all the things that we're doing is sending the message to the public that you've got a green light to commit crime. Nobody will do anything to you. And the jail in LA County is, I'm going to bet you, still full.
Well, you know what they did is when I was running the jail population, we had about 18,000 inmates. They're down to 14,000 after they did the whole COVID thing and they pushed everybody out. But we got some other issues that have nothing to do with bail reform. But I wanted to talk about, has your organization analyzed Harris County to see, with their policies in comparison with another similar county in Texas, has it reduced crime, which is the urban legend, the unicorn that has showed up, the pixie dust that's been sprinkled by these guys? Has that reduced crime in Harris County in comparison to a similar county that still uses bail?
Let me make a couple points on that. So number one, the sheriff's office had a press conference about a year ago saying, oh, crime is going down. This is all working. And you know what came out in the last month? It just came out that they have been hiding, that they have closed over 260,000 investigations, and they closed them with the administrative notation, lack of staff, and closed them. So their numbers on crime are artificially deflated because they are just hiding it. We have a report from the district attorney, who's a Democrat, who looked at these reforms and said they're causing a 50% increase in failure to appear rates. The Houston Police Officers Union did a study of 1 week's docket for misdemeanors and said 8,000 people were supposed to show up for this week. 70-something% failed to appear. And then if you go to harriscountycourtwatch.com, they downloaded 2 years worth of data from the district clerk's office and applied the same formulas that the police officers applied, and found a 2-year average of an 80% failure to appear rate. I looked at they issue a report monthly on what did they do on all the cases that were disposed of for that month. Over 90-something% were dismissed. That's how they're keeping their system from collapsing, and they're trying to do more in the felony area, but they're getting a huge pushback. In fact, they filed a federal lawsuit that was ultimately dismissed, so they did not expand this to felony. But what did the misdemeanor courts do? Since we're showing how bad people are about appearing, they quit requiring defendants to show up for court. Yeah, and I'm looking at, got to pick your jaw up. Yeah, I know, it's that shocking.
Well, we had, as you heard, we have progressive, I guess, is the word that was used by some folks from the MacArthur Foundation when they evaluate us against like Cook County and Harris County, Texas, and other places. And you're right, when you give citations, it increases your number of failures to appear because people don't show up. It increases the number of warrants in your system. Yep. And I think when I was doing an evaluation, I want to say we had like 1.5 million active warrants in our system at one time, which is, and when I was doing an evaluation, we were arresting about 160,000 people a year when I was still working. So that was a couple years ago.
So the 160,000, I'm terrible at math. What's that about a week? That's how many new cases are being added to the system.
That's new cases. And then if they're all getting citations and a big chunk of them aren't showing up without any mitigating efforts,
Yeah.
for them to show up in court, then your problem explodes. And then there's this concept
Mhm.
of due diligence. When you have a warrant in the system, you have to show that you're actually looking for them actively. I know I used to do that one as a detective. Otherwise, it can get stale and they can just drop out.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so it does overwhelm the system, and it really isn't effective. But we did have some things that we don't have in the system now that really concern me, and and that is when you talk about risk. So one of the things when I was on these different panels or groups they had me look at is we were at least looking at risk for bail reform, and there really are two risks that we're talking about, and I maybe you can expand upon them. One is the risk of showing up in court. Will they show up in court? That's one. The other one is the risk, will they continue to commit crime? Those are the two risks that you evaluate whether you give bail. Uh, Am I right on that? And do you want to expand upon that a little bit?
No, I think those are the two things that we look at when we're setting bail. But I think the number one thing that will be a predictor of that is your criminal history. Uh, when someone has had 7 previous felony charges and missed court in each one of those cases that they were given bail, uh, under the Texas Constitution, when they have more than 2 previous felony convictions, you can deny bail. But what does Harris County do? In light of 7 previous felony convictions, in light of the fact that they've missed court 7 times, they grant them a bond, a $10,000 bond, surety bond. I mean, okay, granted, but still, they should not be released from jail. You've been given that authority. The problem you have is in California, you don't look at criminal history because you've got a charge-based release system, and you look at the charge that they have, and that determines whether they're released or see a magistrate. And there's a whole bunch of really bad things that are on the you don't have any discretion. You don't get to look at their criminal history. You just have to release them. And that's probably the worst time of release because there's no discretion from the judges. They can look at this guy and say, I know what's fixing to happen. I can't do anything about it.
Yeah, and the thing about it is we actually used to have a fairly efficient system. I wouldn't say it was a great system
Mhm.
where we did evaluate people who wanted to get out, who were not entitled to bail initially, like it was a mandatory bail thing, but they could call a judge after hours and get evaluated, and they would look at their criminal history. They'd look at failures to appear. They look at a variety of things, look if they have a job history, and then they would grant them release on their own recognizance. We did everything we could to be fair in the system. And I think that's the other thing I think we need to talk about is the argument that it's about economics. And I grew up blue collar. So had I been
Mhm.
arrested as a teenager, I'd have been in
Yeah,
jail for a while, you know what
I
I
would
mean?
have
So
too.
I understand that argument that hey, just because you don't have money doesn't mean that you should be forced to stay in jail. And I agree with that, but we did have mechanisms for getting somebody who hadn't been in trouble before out of jail already. So do you want to let's address that because that's the big myth. Everybody's in jail that has never committed a crime before, and they should be able to get out. And just because
I
they
agree with you. There's no misdemeanors. I don't even think there's misdemeanor people in Texas that are first time offenders that can't get out of jail. And in Texas, if you set a bond for $1,000, they can get out for $20 in a payment plan. And so I don't think there's any. I mean, I think when they say that, that's absolutely not true. And so I just don't understand. Well, okay, the bail industry is an easy target to say
yeah,
people are being mistreated. I understand that. But the problem is, like you said, they argue about poor people, but the rules have nothing to do with poor. It is just release, simple release, and it gets rid of all accountability. And the problems that you're seeing in California and across the country and other urban areas is absolutely a direct result of these terrible bail policies. It's giving the green light for people to say, hey, I can commit more crime. Nobody's going to do anything to me. They can't even hold me, and they can't even make me go to court. And you know what? Eventually, they'll dismiss my case.
yeah, it's crazy because the other thing is when you have the judicial hearing, you place a lot of the burden that we didn't used to have on the judges and the officers. And one of the this is just one of those things that I say all the time is they keep placing more and more administrative burden on law enforcement. And I think the goal is to make sure that we're inefficient and
Sure.
ineffective so that they can suggest, see, look how much money it costs for us to do this. We need to give money to the public or the people and community-based organizations. So they add more and more administrative layers onto law enforcement and then say that they're inefficient. and our efforts to be efficient are called racist or
Oh yeah. Anytime, I
systemic
did a
racism.
debate recently with a representative of the, extreme side, that's filing this litigation, and they were making the same arguments, even though multiple courts of appeals had rejected them. And that's the ultimate irony. They keep saying they win these cases, but the courts of appeals keep reversing them, and they keep making the arguments they've lost without any recognition that they've lost the arguments. And so when I'm making points and it starts to hurt or sink in, then they turn to jails or cages, and Ken's a racist. And so it's toxic language intended to cut off debate. It's not. They don't want to have a discussion on the real issues, because when you tell them crime's going up, they're saying, no, it's not. That's just a perception issue. I mean, you've got the FBI stats coming out from this administration saying crime is going down. The president of the United States saying crime's at a 50-year low. And I'm like, the Oakland NAACP doesn't agree with that. They just issued a letter in the last 6 months demanding for a state of emergency on crime. And the governor of California gave them extra California police officers to try to address crime. They don't think crime is at a 50-year low. And the reason why the statistics, other than we're changing things to not be crimes and now we're just calling them public disturbance, also the vast majority of the country is still using all the things that Todd Rogers and you talked about of, how we decrease crime, the broken windows theory. I mean, the ultimate irony is all the things we're trying has no research to support. There's nothing that we teach in our criminology classes that say, hey, this will work. We're doing social experiments with no evidence, and all the evidence coming in says they're an absolute failure. When Yolo County issues a study saying that if the comparison of someone released on a surety bond versus simple release means that even on a low-level crime that they have a 200% greater chance of committing a violent offense in the next 18 months, why would you release somebody and put them in a worse position if you don't care? And then look at the victims. Who's the people getting hurt the most? The people they say they're trying to help, because crime in our minority communities go up faster when crime increases. And look at murder victims. 50% of all murder victims in the United States are young Black males. Who's doing the murdering? Usually people from the same demographic. We have turned this all on its head, and we've decided we're going to favor the young Black male murderer over the young Black male victim. And that's crazy.
It is crazy. And I'll, obviously I push back on this stuff a lot. And I'll just give you some stats. In 2014, when we passed Prop 47, we had 13.1 murders per 100,000 in California. I'm sorry, 1993, that's what we had. And 2014, so 1993 was the height of the crack epidemic. It was at the height of crime that was out of control. In 2014, we were down to 4.4 murders per 100,000. Think about the thousands of lives that we saved with the broken windows theory and the strategies that we used. We actually saved the lives of the people who were in prison, because if they'd been on the street, they'd been killed.
That's right. That's right.
And then 2022, we were up to 5.7. And I actually did the math. If you took from 2014, because I like doing the math, right? 2014 all the way through to 2022, and you use 2014 as the baseline, we had 2,200 more people died, in my opinion, because of the failed policies that came out of Prop 47 between 2014 and 2022. That's what that means. In 2022, it was 520 more homicides than in 2014. Those are the numbers. And here's another number that I think that is important when we talk about the bail reform. We used to have these things called drug courts. And in the drug court, you would get arrested, you'd go to jail, and you'd see a judge. And sometimes at the arraignment, sometimes at the preliminary hearing, they'd offer you a deal. Hey, go to treatment or go to jail. Lots of guys, the guys would go to jail because they figured it was only a couple of weeks. But other guys, you could peel some people off, and they would start that recovery process. Since Gascon stopped prosecuting drug and alcohol charges here, and since we now have bail reform, there's no way to push them in any treatment program at all, because they won't.
And you're having record overdoses every month.
That's exactly right. And that's where I was getting at. In when Gascon came in office, we had 2,500 overdoses in 2020. In 2022 is up to 3,200 overdoses in a year.
Yeah.
That is huge. And that is because not only the permissive policy with drugs, the failure to prosecute
Mhm.
them, but also because we're not put people in jail to get treatment. And here's if I had to pick one thing that was broken in the system, and you can certainly comment, and that is putting the correction back in corrections. They
Mhm.
they had me in charge of correctional programs, and we implemented drug and treatment programs in the county of Los Angeles jails, and we started with 50, and by the time I left, we were up to 900. Some resistance, bureaucratic resistance, but I saw treatment, and then we were bridging them to the outside, so it was a continuous treatment, right? So there are common sense solution to reducing jail population through treatment, through giving people help, but it has to be based upon data because they were measuring data. They had control groups and this and that, and
Sure.
they were measuring, and they were determining what the outcome was, and they were using the gold standard cognitive behavioral therapy programs as part of changing the thinking of the criminals. So it was really good stuff, but you can only get them in that system by using the criminal justice
By
system. I
having the
think
hammer of the criminal justice system. And the reality is, you know, this is something that Gascon, but our progressive people are not getting hammered for. We're giving up on a generation of people that are getting sucked into the drug world. And also we're, you know, no wonder crime is going up. How many, you know, is it like 80% of all crime we can trace to drug trafficking in some way or another? I mean, what would you expect? And, you know, when you go back to, they release people from the jail for jail recruiting for medical reasons, or they pushed them down to the county and then the county started releasing them. I mean, which makes more common sense? Oh, we're going to release all these convicted criminals and we're going to have less crime. Or, hey, just like in the 60s, we release more convicted criminals, we're going to have more crime. And just like in the 60s, we start having a debate of how to address it. We start having this big fight, and one side of the debate refuses to do anything. And so we end up having a backlash. We have Reagan and we have this strong position on crime. And it seems like we're repeating the exact same problems of the 60s.
well, one of the things I talk about is okay. So if it's a lack of equity because we put too many people of color in prison, how is it equitable if we release them and more people are dying and those people are of color? There's no equity in that. I can't
Well, but
find
the
the equity.
only the whole we've got more people of color in prison, that argument is only valid if we have if they're committing fewer crimes. And,
Yeah.
you know, Minnesota just released a study that we've highlighted in the last year or so, where they tracked racial groups of the people making accusations of crime and the people arrested. And what they found was the people complaining of crime and the people being arrested for crime, the demographics were way out of whack because there was a lot more from the color, from that racial group than, and so that explained why there was a lot more of that demographic in jails, because they had a disproportionate amount of crime that they were committed, and they were committing it on the same racial group. They were
Yes.
they were the ones reporting it. And
Yeah.
so it is a talking point, it is a dog whistle, and it doesn't have anything to do with reality. And I don't know what the fix is for that. And I think I would love to hear you address, you're right in the center, the eye of the storm.
Yeah.
How is this going to get fixed in California and LA County? How is it eventually going to change? Because it's not sustainable what we're doing right now.
Well, I think the fact that we had a lot of great candidates step up to run against Gascon and call him out for his failed policies. It's unfortunate. I'm doing my part. I just deconstructed the editorials, the lies in the editorials, and it was funny. I took one editorial where they said we're tougher than Texas on retail theft, and so I pulled up Prop 47. This is what Prop 47 says. This is what our laws are. This is what Texas criminal statute says. We are not
Well, the
tougher
DA
than
in
Texas.
Dallas County announced they were going to do the same thing and quickly dropped it a year later. So
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
yeah,
so,
you're a
so
lot
I'm doing
tougher.
my part. I got to be the alternative a source of information, and our audience is growing. I definitely appreciate KJR Radio giving it a voice. But let's look at your study. Now, you did a study, a review of failed bail reform from around the country. I just want to hit a couple states. So Colorado, right? They
Yep.
implemented bail reform, and their results were not good, right?
No, but the counties that are the states that we've highlighted, or states that have attempted bail reform, found that, they did not like the results and started rolling it back. I mean, Alaska's another state where they enacted it, and the very people that came in and said, "Hey, this is what's going to happen," they called them back and said, "You told us this is what was going to happen, and it's not." And their response is what you hear all over the place. You're hearing it in New York. Well, we just need more time, and so they said,
Yes.
we're rolling this back. And same thing. I mean, that's before New York, but New York's now rolled back their bail reform 4 times, and I would say we're fixing to have another rollback, because this is, I mean, if you believe some of the articles that we're seeing, you're going to have a tsunami in some of these states where these progressive DAs are pushing for essentially decriminalization. Let me ask you, what would these progressive DAs be doing differently if they were in the pocket of organized crime, gangs, and career criminals? What would they be doing differently?
Nothing. They'd be doing exactly what they're
I
doing.
mean,
They might be more selective on who they do it with, but they
mm,
would be doing exactly what they're doing
yeah,
now.
I don't think there's anything else they could be doing, because they're being so soft on crime. It's almost like, are you getting paid off to do this? Because it doesn't make common sense. And whether they're being paid off by Soros or, by organized crime, is there a freaking difference?
No, it's unfortunate. A couple of things. When I worked with these folks, I said, don't overpromise, because if you overpromise and
Mhm.
underdeliver, you're going to
Yeah,
lose the support
yeah,
of the public, which is what I
absolutely.
see is happening now. We only got about a minute left to go, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk about your organization
Sure,
and the importance. You have a lot of great resources on your website. Why don't you talk a little bit about
sure.
that, and tell people where to go to get that information?
Well, if you want more information about bad bail reforms, I probably call it, you can go to pbtx.com. We have a blog where we highlight important stories in the bail reform movement, or the criminal justice reform movement. We also have our own podcast called The Bail Post. There's a link on our website, but you also can just go to thebailpost.com. The purpose of that is to educate people, educate legislators. So if you want to know what the New Jersey plan is, we've got an episode on what the New Jersey plan is, and it explains really well why no other state has proposed the New Jersey plan, even though it was one of the first ones to have reform, because it was too expensive. All these reforms, the purpose is to save money, not spend more money. And
Yeah.
that's why you see just simple release. Simple release is the worst thing you can do. And we're doing it because we don't want to spend any more money, and we're being pushed by one side of the spectrum of the debate. And it's out of whack. It's crazy. And so we're trying to educate the public and the legislators on what the consequences of those types of reforms are.
Well, Ken, I appreciate you coming on my show. I would extend the invitation for you to come on anytime again, and I certainly will reach out to you as it heats up a little bit more in LA County,
Sure.
so you can add some expert testimony to what works, what doesn't work. And there's so many things we didn't get into
Yeah.
that we could clearly talk about in terms of bail reform, but I appreciate you coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed it very much.
All right, Ken, well, you take care in Texas, that Lone Star State. If I got to leave California, I'm going to hit up Ken for a pass to Texas. Amanda and Chanel, you guys can take it away.